Morning, kids! In this week's episode, we're looking at the different faces of the Conservative Party, specifically the face that we see when they're not trying to convince us, the public, but just fellow Tories, such as during the current Conservative leadership race. Because that's when we see who they really are. But first, let's look at who they're claiming to be. Since the Brexit referendum in 2016, they've been trying to paint themselves as the party of the non-London working class. And that's smart, because if you live in Sunderland, Hull, Redcar, you know that the system hasn't worked for you for generations. Because London may have similar levels of poverty, but it still has better opportunities and infrastructure than you could ever dream of. Suffice to say, there's no underground tube system in Grimsby. So if you weren't an EU expert, and very few of us were, then that referendum was about choosing who to trust. So if you're somebody who's seen no improvement in your town your entire life, and the leaders of the two major parties, one of whom has been financially strangling you and everybody you love for 6 years via austerity, and they're telling you to vote for things to stay the same? Meanwhile, you've got a splinter group of Tories led by Boris Johnson saying they're going to rip up the system and
give it back to you, the people.
Pumping hundreds of millions of pounds a week into the service that takes care of us all. I'd have voted leave. Because I wouldn't have known that these are the same people who voted to cut financial support to struggling families and defund local governments at every opportunity throughout their careers. And that's the problem. These are people who've always taken the side of the rich while ordinary people struggle. And when they're talking to themselves and not us, it all comes out. For example, in the last leadership race back in 2019, this is what Boris Johnson said to convince Tory members to make him leader of the party.
I can't think of any other politician, even Conservative politician, who from the crash of 2008 onwards actually stuck up for the bankers. Can you think of anybody who stuck up for the bankers as much as I did? I defended them day in, day out.
Think about what you just heard. It's the failure of the Tory government to take care of people after the 2008 financial crisis that led people to vote for Brexit, driven by their anger at the elites who seemed to be bailed out while ordinary people suffered. And here's one of the people who fueled that Brexit anger, using the chaos of Brexit to become Prime Minister by pointing out how much he sided with the bankers while ordinary people were literally dying. And here's Priti Patel at a Tory party conference talking about human rights lawyers.
The do-gooders, the lefty lawyers, the Labour Party, they are defending the indefensible.
Using do-gooders as an insult is some cartoon villain shit. Seriously, if you watched a Marvel movie where the bad guy used do-gooders as an insult, you would groan, because we all prefer villains who at least think they're doing the right thing. The Tories are making me legit miss Thanos. And they don't even hide their motivations. When the Tories started making moves to get rid of Boris Johnson, Nadine Dorries jumped to his defence by saying,
"The Conservative Party donors have said themselves that they aren't going to support the party if the Prime Minister is removed." I think a number of MPs in marginal seats need to hear that and need to understand what they're doing. £80 million those donors have donated to the Conservative Party over recent times.
Now, not only is it insane to be announcing on TV that billionaires are able to use bribes to decide who runs the country, but given that £2 million of the Tory party's donations have come from sources linked to the Russian government, it's basically saying that Putin should have a say in running our country while we're in a proxy war with him. And that brings us to this week, because the two remaining candidates have basically been competing with each other to see who can say, kill the poor, help the rich the loudest. Liz Truss was asked whether she would tax the profits of energy companies who are currently bleeding people dry.
Shell is giving their shareholders £6.5 billion. People at home watching who can't afford to heat their homes come the winter will be horrified at that.
But look at who these shareholders are. These shareholders are often people with pensions, pension funds. The shareholders are not, all sort of men in suits sitting in offices.
Those companies are seeing their highest profits in 14 years, while ordinary people are seeing the sharpest fall in living standards since the 1950s, and she bluntly took the side of the energy companies. She also published and deleted a plan to put public sector pay in line with the cost of living in those areas, which basically means a pay cut for teachers, nurses and firefighters outside of London. This from a government that has built their entire identity around levelling up those areas of the country that have been left behind while London advanced. And the MP most likely to become Prime Minister is saying we should cut the wages of people outside of London to save money. But even though she deleted the policy, it was still a smart play, because according to polling, 63% of Conservative Party members are against the idea of shifting wealth from the rich to the poor. But Rishi Sunak looked at that and thought, nah, that's way too subtle. So he went to Tunbridge Wells, which is quite a rich town in the southeast, and said,
I managed to start changing the funding formulas to make sure that areas like this are getting the funding that they deserve. Because we inherited a bunch of formulas from the Labour Party that shoved all the funding into deprived urban areas, and that needed to be undone. I started the work of undoing that.
Man literally said, the poor have too much money, so let's give some to the rich, during a financial crisis when people are struggling to pay their bills. And while we're here, there's a point that needs to be made. Tunbridge Wells is 97.5% white, so when Rishi Sunak says he's been taking money away from deprived urban areas, which suffice to say are not 97.5% white, it's actually a key piece in a different puzzle. Now I'm going to need you to stick with me on this one because it's got a few steps. According to the Home Office itself, the new Policing Act, which almost all Tories, including Liz Truss and Rishi Sunak, voted for, will disproportionately impact black people by giving police officers new powers to stop and search people, even if there's no reason to suspect that individual of committing a crime. And given that the government figures already show that police stop black people 7 times more than white people, this will only make things worse. But the Home Office says this is objectively justified by the high crime stats in those deprived urban areas. Ignoring, of course, that the government's own stats also say that white people are more likely to have drugs on them when they're stopped and searched. But it's interesting because in the Beating Crime Plan that the Tories published last year, they acknowledge that poverty and a lack of access to jobs is a major factor in crime rates. And in the race report, again, commissioned by this government, it says that UK employers are 45% less likely to call someone back for interview if they have a black-sounding name. It also says that the reason for this might be because employers assume that black people are from a lower class. You know, like being from one of those deprived urban areas that have a lot of issues with policing. And Rishi Sunak just said he's been deliberately taking money away from those deprived urban areas and giving them to 97.5% white, rich areas. Do you see the problem? Intentionally take money away from areas with higher numbers of black people, ensuring that it's harder for them to get a job, and when the lack of opportunity and increased desperation leads to higher crime rates, you use that to justify passing new laws to allow police officers to discriminate against black people even more, all while denying the existence of systemic racism. But both candidates seem to be trying to win over Tory members by attacking the poor, so why not throw in a bit of racism to sweeten the deal? They don't care about convincing the public at large because we don't get a vote. Like the polls consistently show that the public think people should have the right to go on strike if they're not being paid enough, and yet Liz Truss says,
I will take a tough line on trade union action that is not helping people get on in life.
Which makes sense because compared to most people, Tory members are much more likely to be employers than employees. They're also much more likely to support censorship, which is why Liz Truss got a big clap for this bit of pure fascism when protesters interrupted one of the debates this week.
I think we have some infiltrators. Can I just say a few words on the militant people who try and disrupt our country and who try and disrupt our democratic process? And I will never, ever, ever allow our democracy to be disrupted by unfair protests.
Unfair protests? The Tories got less than 44% of the vote at the last election, and yet because of our voting system, they got a huge controlling majority over the UK Parliament. So whoever becomes Prime Minister next month will have the power to do whatever they like, regardless of the wishes of 56% of UK voters. And there are 160,000 Tory members, so less than 0.2% of UK voters will decide who runs the country. And Liz Truss is saying that the protesters who dare to speak out during that process are the ones being unfair, and that as Prime Minister, she would ban them? Then we have Rishi Sunak saying that if you strongly criticise the UK, you'll be treated as a terrorist.
What this is guidance to all the people involved in the PREVENT programme so they know what to look for, and that's based on the evidence of how we root out terrorism in this country. And it's right that we call out those who are trying to undermine the values of our society.
Again, this entire process is a joke. We have the worst people in the country trying to impress the worst people in the country about how much damage they can do to the most vulnerable people in the country during the most financially difficult years of their lives. And the worst thing is, they feel comfortable letting that mask slip and showing how little they actually care about the people who saw them as their last hope back in 2016, because those people don't get a say right now. It's too late. There's no general election coming up. And they're counting on the fact that people are so desperate just trying to survive right now that they'll have forgotten all this by the next election and they can just lie to them again. We deserve better. And I'm not just saying that because it sounds nice. Mathematically, we deserve better. The majority of UK voters have voted to the left of the Conservatives in all but 3 elections since the Second World War. Take the last election as an example. You can add up the votes of the Tories, the Brexit Party, the DUP, UKIP. It's still barely 46% of the vote. But if you add up Labour, the SNP, the Lib Dems, the Green, that's over half already. So we objectively deserve more compassion from our government. So it's not good enough to just blame Tory voters and Tory MPs for the suffering that we're continuing to see. Blame the leaders of the opposition parties for repeatedly failing to work together to get the Tories out and give us a voting system where every vote counts equally. Because between them, they have the votes to do it, but they've been prioritising their own party political squabbles over saving the people of the UK from being shoved further into poverty and fascism for the rest of our lives. Have a great week.